Good evening and welcome to the Westport Library. My name is Bill Harmer and I'm the Executive Director. In this challenging year, the Westport Library pivoted to provide a wide array of virtual programs that educate, inform, and entertain people of all ages. From fabulous drive-in music concerts at the Imperial parking lot with our partner at the Chamber of Commerce, to a robust lecture series to our annual Story Fest, Connecticut's largest literary festival. Library programs, while remaining virtual, continue to reflect the breadth of interest in this community. Tonight will be no different. We are deeply honored this evening to present a virtual conversation with retired General Wesley Clark. As many of you may know, General Clark created a nonprofit in 2019 to promote and achieve greater common ground in America by reducing partisan division and gridlock. His mission to revitalize public and political discourse by teaching and promoting civics, citizenship, and civility could not be timelier. We're very grateful to Library Trustee Krishna Patel for bringing General Clark to Westport. Krishna has had a distinguished legal career serving as a federal prosecutor in the Southern District of New York and as the Deputy Chief of National Security and Major Crimes in the District of Connecticut. She has received numerous awards for leading prosecutions ranging from national security and espionage cases to international child trafficking cases. She has served on UN committees, is a TEDx speaker, and has made numerous appearances on television. It is my privilege to introduce Krishna Patel, who will introduce General Clark.
So good evening, everyone. I'm so thrilled and excited about this evening, and a special thanks to Bill and Nancy and this entire library staff. It was a challenging year for everybody, and what this library has done for this community, not just during COVID, but the work that they have done this summer for not just children in Westport, but with a focus with children in Bridgeport and throughout the state. And also to now do this type of virtual programming that can be seen by anyone, anywhere. It is truly remarkable that they continue not just pivot, but to catapult, to provide some of the most extraordinary type of programming at a time that it is so desperately needed to a community of learners everywhere. I have today, obviously, the incredible honor of introducing our speaker. And in terms of his bio, it is something that is readily available and will take some time to read. And as I thought about my remarks, the easiest thread to pull is something from his bio, which speaks to a truly remarkable career. But I thought what I would instead do is share something that I think very few people know about. And there is so much that most people don't know about General Clark that I think really has influenced the man he has become, and the person that he continues to be for our country. And so at some risk, I thought I would tell a little bit more of a personal story. It may even be an origin story to talk about General Clark's background. I don't think most people know that his biological father, Jacob, was born in Russia. He and his family were born there and lived there, and they were a Jewish family in Russia in the late 1800s. And as the Russian government began a practice of some pretty striking and difficult anti-Jewish policies throughout the country, the family fled. I think I have it right that they actually got a passport, a German passport, and made their way to the United States. They ended up in Chicago, where Jacob eventually met General Clark's mother, who was a Southern Christian woman from Arkansas. And together, they may have actually had one of the first ever interfaith marriages in Chicago. Jacob actually passed away when General Clark was only 3 years old. And so his mother took him back to Arkansas, to her roots, lied about her age to get a job at a bank. And he was raised for much of his youth by a single mother in Arkansas. And it's later in his life that the Mr. Clark comes into his life. At the age of 16, as a senior in high school, spending a lot of time hunting and fishing, but got a 4.0 and attended services at his local Baptist church. He is someone who then got accepted to all of the schools that so many of the Westport parents want their kids at here in the Northeast, but was very driven to serve his country. And so he made attempts to get into West Point, which, as many of you know, require some type of endorsement, usually from your senator. And neither one of the senators in Arkansas actually endorsed him or were willing to. And they both indicated that he was either too small, too young, and with that 4.0, maybe not smart enough. Nevertheless, through some series of events, including taking a civil service exam, which of course he scored the highest, his congressman endorsed him to go to West Point. And so he entered West Point, and 4 years later, of course, graduated valedictorian. And his mother, 25 years after working at the bank, ended up being the first female officer ever at the bank. And the reason I bring this up is because his professional career is truly remarkable. It's even stunning, and it's uncommon. But his personal life, his personal story, I think, is very much an American story. And it, like so many others, the son of a Russian Jewish immigrant and a woman from Arkansas, who then goes on to, among other things, become a 4-star general, and actually takes on one of my most favorite titles, which is Supreme Allied Commander, is a story that I believe can only be told in this country. And it is perhaps the conditions that were created that benefited the American story that are the ones that feel so broken to so many of us now, and that we're seeing play out in its brokenness throughout this country. It was really, I think, a conversation with Bill about bringing General Clark here at this particular time, because more than anyone, he has a very deep appreciation for all of American history, but he has had a front row seat through much of it. And it is through talking to him that I have really come to understand Mark Twain's quote that history does not repeat, but it often rhymes. And he understands the cycles of optimism and despair and pessimism. He is certainly somebody who understood despair as he was severely injured during battle in Vietnam, and knows optimism about this country as he had a front row seat in molding and shaping what became American exceptionalism. So I don't think there's anyone better to actually kind of talk us through or talk with us about what feels like a cycle of going into the winter for the human spirit, and to really understand what progress requires, the fact that progress can be easily threatened, that we need to make our efforts to redouble and recommit to it, and how to reimagine a framework for the future so that progress can include everyone. So with that, it is my great personal honor to introduce a true American hero, General Wesley Clark.
Well, thanks very much, Krishna. Krishna, thank you for that introduction. Look, I'm really excited about this talk because it's a chance to really explain what I've learned about America. I've been a lucky fellow. I got to be in the military for 34 years. I made it through Vietnam. I had a high command position. I did some good things in the military, I think, at least by military standards. I've been out for 20 years. I got to run to be, as a candidate to be president of the United States in the 2003-2004 election cycle. I ran as a Democrat because I was against the war in Iraq and thought it was unnecessary, thought it was going to be a big strategic blunder. And I was right, but I was right too soon. I didn't get elected. But I learned an awful lot about the country. 30 states in 90 days, raised 20 some odd $1 million, which was very good for that cycle. Won the primary in the state of Oklahoma, came in second in a bunch of other states, and went back then into the private sector in investment banking, worked with a lot of big firms in private equity, Goldman Sachs, Clayton, Dubilier and Rice, Blackstone. And then I have my own investment bank now. I consult. I do business all over the world. I'm affiliated with UCLA's Berkeley Center, so I see a little bit of college. I give a lot of talks on college campuses. And I've written some books, and I've thought a lot about the country. And that's what I want to share with you tonight. Now, I'm not going to talk about military policy, military strategy, foreign policy, Russia, China, or whatever, unless you want to during the Q&A. But as Krishna alluded to, it's where are we right now as a country? And if you look at American history, there are big 40, 50, 60-year cycles in history. From the end of the Civil War through maybe 1905, 1910, 1912. It was the Gilded Age. And American capitalism ran wild at the expense of workers. We became the greatest industrial power in the world. And then there was the reaction. It was the progressive movement. It was World War I, the Depression. Roosevelt came in, and then Johnson came in and finally finished it. And even Nixon went along with it. We put in so many wonderful programs, and that's the America everybody uses as a standard. And then starting in 1980, you could say it's the age of Reagan. It's the third major cycle since the Civil War. It's not over, but each cycle has been marked as it ends by rising anger, popular protests, and some kind of massive flip-flop in policies and programs and law. And so that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about how we went from the America that was great under Roosevelt and Eisenhower, the America of Doris Day and Mary Tyler Moore, the America where we all saw Annette Funicello in the Mickey Mouse Club and thought we were in the most wonderful country in the world. And we had dreams of space programs. And then suddenly just something happened. And here we are today. So what are the points along that journey? How do we define the, let's call it, trajectory of American history, culture, politics, economics? What causes these cycles, and what should we be doing about them? So let me give you some of the points along this. So as I said, where we started was through the Depression, the challenges of World War II, and then the veterans that returned. We had a sense of common purpose, and we believed that government was there to provide a public service. So government supported civil aviation because that was going to be a public service for mail carrying. Government believed the airways were public. That's what citizens believed. So we regulated the airways. We had a fairness in media law. We only allowed a certain part of a community's airways to be owned by a single group. We were pretty tough on antitrust at the time, but government could do big things. We built the interstate highway system. We had debt coming out of World War II. Marginal tax rates were 91% at the top level, 91%. And, that was staggering. And there was a heavy inheritance tax, and a lot of people didn't like it. And but that's where we were in that great part of American history. Unions were strong. In fact, when Harry Truman tried to break the steelworkers strike in 1952 during the Korean War, the Supreme Court said he didn't have the authority to do it. And of course, executives always made more than workers, but they made 10, 15, 20 times more than workers. They didn't make 400 times. And corporations, a lot of them had retirement programs, pension plans that were like the militaries. They were what you call today a defined benefit plan. Work 20 years, retire at half your pay, or something like that formula. And workers expected to receive pay hikes based on improvements in corporate productivity. If they did their part, they wanted their share of the outcome. The pension plans themselves were pretty restricted to AAA securities, maybe some blue chip stocks, but there was an expectation of progress. I remember as a child watching Ronald Reagan every Sunday night on General Electric Theater. And if I could see your faces out there, I'd probably see people nodding who you probably remember it too. He said every Sunday night, he said, progress. He said, at General Electric, progress is our most important product. And my mother would say, oh, I just love that Ronald Reagan. He's so wonderful. He used to be married to that actress, Jane Wyman. And he built a huge cult following based on progress is our most important product. We had big military investment. This was new for America, but the military investment in technology spun off wonderful things like integrated circuits and chips and eventually the internet. And during this period, Americans became concerned about really living up to their values. It wasn't just that Lyndon Johnson finished Medicare, which Roosevelt wanted to put in the 30s but couldn't, But Lyndon Johnson took a huge risk. He pushed civil rights, voting rights, and there were women's rights, and the environmental movement all emerged during that period. But what happened? So I want to look at actions, the ideas behind the actions, and then the forces that generate those ideas. So what were the actions and policies? Well, I mean, step by step, the actions and policies were to remove the guardrails, the restrictions, the community focus that built that great America of the 1950s and 60s. And both parties participated in it. You see, as early as the late 1950s, some labor unions were being investigated, and it proved that labor unions were corrupted. And the union movement then, by 1981, it was kneecapped. Ronald Reagan cut off the strike by the airline traffic controllers union. And when he did that, he really sounded the death knell of the growth of the union movement. And then there was the Vietnam War. And as the Vietnam War built up with the draft, so did the social protest movements associated with it. And that combined with demonstrations for civil rights and women's rights and freedom of speech and so forth, basically the country's priorities went from winning the space race against Russia and putting a man on a moon into social programs. At the same time, there was an Immigration Act passed in the mid-60s. Senator Ted Kennedy led it. And by the 1970s, there was a flow of immigrants widening to the United States. And these weren't from Scotland and Germany and Britain. These were immigrants from around the world, and especially from south of the border. And then because there was such a thirst for media and television, and it was from radio to television to color television, well, it was an investment opportunity. And wasn't it wrong to limit ownership? Because didn't the public want to see more programs? And so, yeah, those ownership restrictions were lifted. So companies like Sinclair were able to buy up all of the radio stations in a single market. In Little Rock, there are 8 radio stations, all owned by Sinclair, all share a common newsroom, and of course, common news. So that was one of the many changes. Cable television came in, and there was a proliferation of news and views. So it wasn't anymore Walter Cronkite and Huntley and Brinkley. There weren't 3 networks. Now you were getting more views. And then we repealed in the late 1980s the Fairness in Media Law. And so this meant you didn't have to tell both sides of the story. You could be a shock jock. Rush Limbaugh, boy, he's made a huge impact on this country. And if you were in the Republican Party, you listened to Rush Limbaugh because he's got his finger on the pulse of your base. I remember giving a speech when I first got out of the military, and I didn't know who Rush Limbaugh was. My wife and I were down at the Everglades Club in Palm Beach, and as we went in, the woman who was escorting us said to my wife, she said, "Don't you just love Rush Limbaugh?" And my wife was like, "Is this a joke or something?" Because she knew who he was. But he carried a huge amount of weight. And then there was coming along behind it the internet and social media in the post-2001 period. This enables Americans to seek the news and opinions with which they agree. So you don't have to read anything that makes you feel bad. It's right there for you to find the news that makes you feel good, that confirms your fears, your prejudices, your hopes. You find it, it's there. You want it, it's there. And politics, as we discovered by careful evaluation of brain waves and blood pressure, politics is really not what they taught us back in the 1950s about, hey, you look at the policies and you sort of choose which policies, right? No, politics is a matter of the emotion. It's about the heart. Bill Clinton had it right. When he ran, he could reach out and massage your heart, and you knew you were the only person he was talking to, and he was interested in you. You felt it. And that's what politics is about. There was a financial dimension to all of this. You know, when we started in the 50s and 60s, we had savings accounts. But then they were superseded by mutual funds, certificates of deposit, mortgages became securitized. We got money market funds. And under President Reagan, of course, taxes were cut from the 70% marginal tax rate at the top down to 28% at one point. And public resources were increasingly constrained. Defined benefit plans were replaced by 401ks. It transferred the risk from the corporation to the individual. Public schools were challenged. We knew we weren't keeping up, but instead of fixing them, we couldn't really. So we built charter schools and private schools and public universities. They didn't have the same money they used to have because people were concerned about tax hikes. And so they raised tuition as public contributions fell. Starting in 1980, really, workers didn't have the same power with unions and still wanted to go on vacation and buy the power boat and the new rifle for deer hunting. And so you might have to use your credit card for that, as well as for this school clothes for the kids every autumn, and maybe for camp in the summer if you could afford it. And parents sought to improve their living standards with credit card debt. The children took on student loan debt. The old usury laws were gone. Used to be in Arkansas, you couldn't charge more than 10%, but once the credit card movement got in there by the banks, didn't take long for the legislatures to throw out that usury law. And so today you can't make 18%, but a bank can on credit card debt. By the late 1990s, the wall between investment banking and commercial banking, the Glass-Steagall Act, was repealed. And a law was actually passed that said, you will not regulate these speculative derivative markets. They're dark, but they'll be regulated by the forces of supply and demand. There was also an impact from events abroad. So when Reagan formally ended the fixed value of the dollar, then this opened up huge opportunities in exchange rate trading. Then OPEC spurred a big hike in the price of oil. The United States became a net importer, and there was a global stagflation. So stagnation of the economy, stock market not going up, high rate of inflation, and it was sort of baked in because workers expected to get pay raises, but interest rates kept going up. And finally, Paul Volcker, appointed by President Jimmy Carter, but it took until early in Reagan's term in 1980, finally killed inflationary expectations with interest rates as high as 15%. My mother loved those rates on her certificates of deposit, but they were tough on the country. Those OPEC price hike, of course, flooded the global markets with petrodollars. And Germany and Japan recovered from World War II. They became major commercial competitors to the United States in automobiles, heavy equipment. And American businessmen struggled to compete, and they said, hey, we can't afford to pay those high wage rates. So unions, you've got to give in. And the end of Maoism in China, and then 10 years later, the fall of the Berlin Wall, suddenly we were in a real global opportunity. And American businesses took their extraordinary skills worldwide in pursuit of lower costs and wider markets. There was NAFTA, then the World Trade Organization, and finally the entrance of China led to new opportunities for subsidiaries and investments overseas. The U.S. economy, meantime, was collecting those pension funds every year, investments from school teachers and firemen and policemen, and they were coming to Wall Street, and you had to do something with the money. And so the economy itself began to shift proportionally from agriculture, mining, and manufacturing toward finance. The take from finance as part of the nation's business profits is roughly tripled in 40 years, from 10% to over 30%. And all these savings and the increasing financialization made capital less valuable. Rates of return were lowered. And so people pursued rates of return through more risky, less secure investments. There were junk bonds and there were derivatives based on home mortgages. And all that financial stuff came apart in 2007 and 2008. So under the Democrats in 2009, we went with the Republican plan that Hank Paulson had set in motion. We saved the big banks. We took Wall Street over Main Street. It wasn't that there weren't reasons for it, but in the 30s, Roosevelt saved farmers and homeowners in less than a year after taking office. Whereas when Democrats were in office, we fussed and we flustered and we negotiated, and millions of homeowners were left with mortgages in or near default for years and years. And millions of people saw their principal means of savings lost. Now, within a few years, the economy mostly recovered. The stock market roared back, employment returned, but more in the services sector. And with that, growing inequality in income and wealth. That was the basis on which Donald Trump played on the fears and insecurities of the voters. He came in with a massive tax cut, debt funded, helped mostly the top 1%, especially real estate developers and operators. He got the stock market up to record levels, but fueled by $1 trillion stock buyback program, which prior to 1983, stock buybacks were illegal. Now, I'm a businessman. I know why we do stock buybacks, but I'm just saying now that that's one of the points along this trajectory you have to take into account. And we've got a trade war with China, paid for not by Chinese, but by ordinary Americans. They had to pay back farmers because they lost so much money. And really got a few diplomatic efforts lubricated by fears of Iran and some trade deals. But look, when COVID hit, Donald Trump couldn't handle the leadership. And more than that, the specter of a failing economy. He wanted to be reelected. He doesn't like to fail. He likes to win, and he wins any way he can. And suddenly, we had a huge drop in the stock market, huge numbers of people unemployed, and it was a shock to the social and economic foundations of the country. And it especially hit minorities and service workers hard, much harder than anybody else. He's fought back by encouraging premature economic reopenings. And actually, he knows, as a Republican, he was there. He's about my age. He saw what happened in the 1960s. People hated those riots that were associated in the 60s with civil rights and the Democratic Convention in 1968 in Chicago. Ordinary people said, we don't believe in violence. So, as Kellyanne Conway said, all that violence, any more violence, well, that's good for Donald Trump's reelection. It's about law and order. Those suburban housewives, yeah, they're afraid. They don't want those troublemakers in their neighborhoods. And that's how he positioned himself. Well, actually, today the stock market is back near record highs. National debt's greater than GDP, 8.5% unemployment, 13.5 million people. Over 205,000 people have died from COVID-19. And you'll be happy to know that sales of gun and ammunition are at near or record levels. America's been divided. That's what happened. Okay, but why? Why did this happen? That's the question. So what were the ideas and forces behind it? So see, when FDR came in during the 1930s, FDR, he'd been Secretary of the Navy under Woodrow Wilson. He knew the progressive movement. He brought a bunch of people in with a bunch of ideas, and they finished the progressive movement. They believed that what was good for the country was what was necessary. There were things that were wrong. Don't look back on this as a golden era. There was ugly racism. There was terrible labor strife and violence. But there was a wholesale transformation of the economy from the Depression through World War II with manufacturing, science, and education, and a new way of looking at the economy, macroeconomics, pioneered by John Maynard Keynes. He said, a lot of us my age, that's all we studied in economics 301, based on a textbook by a man named Samuelson. And we believe that you could do deficit spending by the government and it would offset the decline in the business cycle caused by overinvestments in inventories. It was really a pretty simple concept, but a big concept, because it said government demand has a big role to play in the economy, and that some deficit spending is not a bad thing. Well, basically, these were the ideas that were current. And Democrats like LBJ, who grew up hard scrabble poor in Texas, he took those ideas and he used them. Even Nixon in 1972 said, we're all Keynesians now. And Americans basically, they didn't like the Vietnam War. They knew we could do a better job with social justice, but they were proud to be Americans. Now, political scientists like Robert Dahl in the 1960s, they despaired looking at the American political system. It was illogical, ungainly, messy. I mean, there were conservative Democrats and liberal Democrats and Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats and liberal Republicans, conservative Republicans. It was more regional than national. And legislating, voting, and socializing occurred across party lines. Why couldn't it be neat and clean like the British movement, with Tories and the Labour Party? Why does it look so messy? And instead of having, good programs, there was log rolling where people would get together and say, I'll scratch your back if you'll scratch mine. I'll vote for your new post office if you'll vote for that military installation in my congressional district. And so it was, members were expected to deliver for their constituencies, new roads, bridges, buildings, military contracts. And the courts generally reflected the prevailing ideas of what's in the common good, what's good for America, the public interest. And can we have a more complete, perfect interpretation and implementation of the Bill of Rights? But, and this is how the cycles start. In the 1960s, new ideas. Barry Goldwater knew he could gather support by relying on America's fear of communism. Well, communism is collective and socialism is collective. And so what's the opposite of socialism? Individualism, self-reliance, the American spirit of the frontier. Goldwater lost decisively in his presidential bid in '64, but Ronald Reagan went from being a Democrat to a Republican. And in '68, he went into the governorship in California, and he took those principles and put them into practice. He smashed protests and unions, and he appealed to that new spirit of individualism, and he made it to the presidency. And from that perch, he disempowered and delegitimated the government of the United States. Now, he could be backed up by new economic ideas. Keynes was obsolete, they said, that really it's only monetary policy. It was Milton Friedman and the Chicago School. Forget about those bad deficits. Government was crowding out the private sector. The problem was supply, not government demand. George H. Bush looked at it when he was running for president in 1980. He said, that's like voodoo economics. But then he became the VP, and that was his economics. Business schools stopped teaching countervailing power with management and unions. They taught shareholder value. The job of the management is to make as much money as possible for the shareholders. That's it. That's what you're focused on. That's what you do. You maximize efficiency. You focus on your core competency. No more of these big conglomerates. You maximize profits. You hold down costs. And that means stop giving those wage hikes to labor. Get rid of that defined benefit pension program, because what the heck? There's people out there who'll take these jobs at half the pay. Get them in there. It's not about your employees. It's about your bottom line. And this was all pitched as new, but actually it's mostly a return to the old way of doing business. Markets, supply, demand, and it was as old as Adam Smith in the 18th century with The Wealth of Nations. But it provided the intellectual basis for a less regulated economy and a lower role for the federal government. And it converted old-fashioned selfishness into a civic virtue. That's what Wall Street was about. And Gordon Gekko became the model for so many. Government became the bogeyman. Regulation was evil. Deficits were a crime. Taxes, that's theft of your money. Now, you see, Washington, D.C. was Democratic, and it was the seat of big government. It was a product of well-educated professionals who held those steady, low-risk, non-competitive government jobs. So in response, the Republicans devolved the idea of federalism, put the authorities, programs, and funding back to the states. Of course, they knew they were facing a big demographic shift because of immigration. So you got to get a new base. And that base became the South and the Midwest. the moral majority, centered around the Baptist and fundamentalist churches, urban Eastern European Catholics, historically unionized and democratic, but as unions became weaker, they became Reagan Democrats, driven that way by resentment of those giveaways and social programs for minorities and immigrants. And of course, you could always appeal to the gun owners. And hey, big business doesn't like regulation. They don't like taxes, and they don't like having to hang on to workers when more labor is out there than you need. It should be driven by supply and demand, not by some social justice notion. And so that was the ethic. Republican donors actively promoted their ideas. They recruited on college campuses. They built young Republicans. They built a well-structured and funded party that was intent on taking over federal governments, not the federal government, but also state governments. And they had a career path for young professionals like Karl Rove. You could work in a campaign, you could work for a congressman, you get placed in a think tank, you move up, and so it was a real meritocratic system, and it worked. It was about wearing a gray slacks, white shirt, red tie, blue sport coat, and of course it helped if you looked a certain way, and they worked. Now these new ideas, of course, in politics, they were matched by new schools of thought in the judiciary. And Krishna, I don't know if you went through this, but of course there was a Federalist Society created, and a rising tide of lawyers attacked judicial activism. They said, go back to the Constitution. And through assiduous work, this idea of originalism became reflected in increasing numbers of men and women in the courts. And today, even the principle of stare decisis, which really is the foundation assumption of the American system of law, is questionable. So there was another element that came in there, and that was that the idea, the way to fight against the evils of Roosevelt and progressivism was to make the corporation a person. I mean, it's a legal person, but a corporation should have its own rights, and that should be the right of free speech. And so starting in 1971, from when Lewis Powell, a lawyer in Virginia, later Supreme Court justice, wrote the paper to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce until 2010, it took almost 40 years, but he did it. Corporations have a right of free speech. They can give as much money as they want. There are PACs. There's dark money in those PACs. And it really blew the lid off controlling money in politics. Finally, it was Newt Gingrich who saw politics as a form of war. He developed the spirit in the Republican Party to crush the opponents. We're not going to work together and build a bigger, better country. We're going to defeat you. We're going to say no compromise. We're going to shut it down. And by the early 1990s, politics had become war without the guns and bullets. Clinton has to be impeached. Hillary's got to be jailed. I remember hearing that in 1994 when I first went to Washington as a three-star general. And finally, there was a push for transparency and democracy in Congress itself. That was a leftover idea. But when we put it in, we continuously televised congressional sessions and hearings. We ended the seniority system for committee leadership, got rid of the earmarking system, and now there was no more log rolling, no more business in smoke-filled rooms, no more compromising, no more service for your constituents, no deals. This was about ideological, pure parties. So we did it. By 2008, we had created opposing ideological parties able to seek and command reservoirs of cash. It was the foundation for pure partisan warfare. For 40 years, through two Democratic administrations, the Democrats attempted to slow the tide, to mediate, to compromise, to work across the aisle to find a, quote, third way, to seek welfare reform, to trim social programs up. But they had no new or powerful ideas of their own. So that's the idea. And then behind it are the forces: human nature, competitive instinct, of course, the economy. I mean, for those of you that have lived through this era, you know the 1960s and 70s were a difficult, confusing period. I mean, men had long hair, women had short skirts, drug use became popularized. There were hippies who actually didn't believe in hard work. Sex was out there, and there was gay pride. And we went to Woodstock and smoked and sang songs and got naked. We had the draft. We didn't like that. And some people went to fight in Vietnam. There were civil rights marches. There were assassinations of political leaders, protests. Much of America stood back and watched. And it was pretty frightening, I can tell you. Fear was on the march. And so during the 1970s, and especially after the election of Ronald Reagan, the United States moved from the feelings of community into separate pools of cultural estrangement. Political parties, of course, they're very competitive. They pick up on the feelings and their opportunities. So for the Republicans, they picked up on fear of change, fear of communism, fear of immigrants, fear of big government. So it was the moral majority to fight to protect Christianity, the ability to say Merry Christmas instead of Happy Holidays, which was supposedly under great threat, right to bear arms. And this went along with fewer economic opportunities and less wage hikes for working Americans. And the less economic opportunities and the more debt and the fewer wage hikes, the more reactionary the sentiment became because it drove insecurity. Finally, it broke into the open after 2008 as the Tea Party. Lurking in the background, of course, riding on the waves of anger, fear, and resentment was the business community. Less regulation, lower taxes, listen to that shareholder, get that money out there. For the Democrats, it was the downtrodden, discriminated against, the idealistic, civil rights, LGBTQ, immigrants. And with the influx of immigrants, the Democrats, of course, had demography on their side. America was going to become more diverse, less white, 4% less each election cycle. But those feelings, the fears, the ambitions, alienation on both parties, they were driven by forces of economic change. Unions didn't protect. Pensions were gone. Big companies weren't loyal. Working people of America in the Midwest, to some degree the South, were being left behind economically, educationally, medically. They were losing jobs, incurring debt. They became Republicans and more populist. Coastal elites found a way through, and there was a widening disparity regionally. The Democrats never very well organized. You may remember Will Rogers said, "I'm a Democrat, I belong to no organized party." The Democrats were left with lawyers, union leaders, urban professionals, technologists, highly educated young people, minorities. But they'd lost the base that put Roosevelt in the White House in the 1930s and kept the Democrats a majority party for half a century. And until the presidency of Donald Trump, they lacked the anger that motivated the majority. So America today is fully divided, partisan, aggrieved, and angry. Friends and family split. Businessmen, colleagues, careful talking politics, especially on the golf course. And the anger and alienation is fueling potential civil strife and conflict. We didn't talk about climate change, China, Russia, the financial system, jobs, or terrorism. But if you want to bring America back together, you've got to start with the economy. And you've got to provide jobs and education. You've got to work to reduce the inequities in opportunities and income. You've got to give people a way forward that they can believe in. We need a new approach. And we need the Democratic Party to come up with those ideas that are practicable, sellable, and can be implemented. It may happen in 2020, 2024, 2028. Cycles are back. Unless Donald Trump can steal the election and end democracy as we know it, we're reaching the end of the age of Reagan. It'll be exciting to see what comes next. Thank you. Alex, I'm not hearing anything.
Okay, sorry about that. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so we have a number of questions tonight already, so I'd like to dive right into those. I'm going to go in the order in which I see the questions were asked. So the first one I see is, what might be the role of the military if Donald Trump loses the election but refuses to accept the orderly transfer of power?
Doesn't really have a role because they're loyal to the commander-in-chief. Until he's declared legally that he's no longer the commander-in-chief, they'll take his orders if they're legal orders. Don't look to the military to save us. They won't.
We have another biggie from Lincoln. He asks, how can we combat the rising polarization and partisanship of American society?
We're going to have to work on the economic foundations of American society. This won't go away easily, but as people find ways forward, find their way through debt, feel a sense of greater hopefulness for the future, we will bring America back together again. But it can't be done without strong federal leadership. You've got to be able to guide the forces of the economy into investments in real tangible things like roads and bridge repair, new industries, new factories, renewable energy. You can't just let Wall Street bankers chase returns through derivative and financial structures or investing in emerging markets overseas.
Anne asks, in your review of the three errors that you described that shape our history, could you speak to the impact of racial injustice?
It's been there all along. It's the ugly, dirty underside of America. The World War I brought African Americans out of the South. They were treated unjustly during the industrial buildup of World War I. They went to Detroit. They manned the factories in the World War II era. They were treated unfairly. There was labor strife, racial strife there. White workers fought against African American workers. It's always been there. And the mythology was that the North's a lot better than the South, but in reality, these are people coming in to take jobs. And look, it's a class system. It's like caste. If you have color, you were in the bottom caste, and it's wrong. We have to work against this because America is much stronger when we work together, use everybody's talents. But it's hard to get through the social conditioning that people have brought from their families, their schools, and their environments.
Arthur asks, what is your assessment of the president's relationship with the military at this time?
Well, the senior military, they know him for what he is. He's a narcissist. He's a hip shooter. He may be in debt to Russia. He makes weird decisions. He does a lot of things on the sly. They're going to do what they are constitutionally obligated to do. They're going to try to dissuade him from doing dumb things. At the bottom, there's a mixed bag. I mean, some of the troops in the airborne units, they probably like him. Hey, it's a guy who likes cage fighting. He's a real man, you know. They probably like that. A lot of the troops are minorities. They don't like it because they see that he's stoking a racial prejudice. In the middle level officer ranks, that article that came out by Goldberg in the Atlantic that said he was calling these people who had suffered and died for their country losers and suckers. The middle ranks said, oh, that's not news. We've all known that. He's been saying that for years. They knew. So Trump has a lot less support in the military leadership than he might want to have. But, you know, they're going to do what their duty tells them to do, regardless of their personal feelings. Probably won't vote for him.
Maggie asks, would you please discuss leadership versus dominance and how these two concepts perhaps have been confused, reducing the stress on diplomacy and placing an excessive burden on the military?
Yeah. Well, okay, there's several strands there. First, you know, the first thing you have to do as a leader is gain trust. And President Trump hasn't gained the trust of a majority of Americans. He didn't set out to. He set out to be a president who builds his base, because that's what he saw as the secret to his election and re-election. You have to take responsibility as a leader. He doesn't take responsibility. He's an entertainer. He's working against his own government. And every day, he's working against his own government. He makes foreign policy decisions against them. He bullies the chief of the Fed. He bullies the Centers for Disease Control. He fires inspector generals. He look, all that racial strife in Portland, that's Trump's America. That's not Joe Biden's America. So on trust and responsibility, he's not very good. He doesn't have a sense of strategy except for his own election. He was asked, what are you going to do in the next term? He's been asked that 3 or 4 times. He didn't have an answer. God knows, I'm sure they're going to try to pound an answer into him before this next debate. But it's like his answer's like, hey, we're doing so great, more of the same. But that's not really an answer. He hasn't brought jobs back to middle America. He hasn't raised wages for ordinary Americans, but he's good for entertainment. So that's the leadership versus dominance issue. He's an entertainer. As someone said, he entertains the same way an abusive father entertains the 4 kids at the table who aren't getting picked on. So he does strike a chord in some people who've grown up in family situations where that's not so unusual, let's say. But and he's a big man, and personally, he is dominant in the room. He's got a strong voice. His hands aren't that small. He really takes care of himself. $70,000 on haircuts, it's a joke, but still looks pretty good by my standards. And so dominance, but not leadership. Okay, what was the second part of the question?
So in that vein, does that place an excessive burden on the military?
Well, the military is going to give options, and he's going to pick those options. But every president is aware of the politics of the national security decisions he makes. When we invaded Haiti to restore democracy in 1994, it wasn't lost on President Clinton that African Americans might like the fact that we had supported President Bertrand Aristide, who'd been overthrown by a military coup in Haiti. So it had a certain political weight to it. But normally those decisions are aligned with U.S. strategic interests. In the case of Donald Trump, this whole caper in Korea, well, he came in looking for a crisis. He created one in Korea. And it turned out that for all the love fest with Kim Jong-un and the love letters that were exchanged and so forth, actually, the Koreans went ahead and finished the build out of their nuclear program. So they're a much bigger threat now than they were 4 years ago, and Donald Trump did nothing about it. But he thought it was advancing him politically at the time. The military's like, oh God, he's going to tell us to strike. There is no military option in Korea, no good military option. And Trump, meantime, is saying, hey, look, this is a negotiation. This is a game, okay? I'm going to tell the guy his building's full of rats and roaches, and then he's going to lower the price. I'm going to tell Kim Jong-un I got a bigger rocket than you do. And but he thought the military didn't get it. But the military just follows orders. So yes, it does put a burden on the military. But so far, thank God, we've had good character in our military leaders, and they're loyal to the Constitution, not to the person who's in the commander-in-chief's seat.
Staying on this theme, Lauren asks, in your opinion, what can or should the Democrats be doing to hold the president accountable and stem the tide of our country's ailments, including COVID, systemic racism, and deep divisions in our citizenry?
Well, I think you just have to keep trying to get a message out again and again to the American people. I was a speechwriter for General Alexander Haig when he was a NATO commander, and he was thinking about running for president as a Republican, of course. He'd been in the Nixon White House. And I noticed he always said the same thing in every speech. I said, sir, you want me to sort of change that speech up? He said, no, you got to keep saying the same thing every time because it takes a long time for the ideas to sink in. And this is the challenge for Democrats. Democrats like a lot of policy ideas, but basically when you run for president, you got to say why you're running. You got to point out what's wrong. It's got to be 80% on what's wrong and 20% how you fix it. And you got to hammer the same things again and again and again. Trump has not shown leadership in the pandemic. Trump has not been a reliable ally. Trump's brought disgrace to America. Trump hasn't brought jobs to middle America. It's the kind of thing Joe Biden's trying to say, and it's a question of how effective the message machine is. We don't have Fox News on the left of the American political system. Fox News, they actually say, hey, what do we have to do to get Donald Trump reelected? They like him. Yeah. Our side of the aisle is, hey, we believe in fairness. We're going to tell you the good and the bad about both candidates. So when you're running as a Democrat, don't expect CNN or the New York Times to give you a break. Ask Hillary Clinton; she'll tell you the New York Times there was no friend. There's sort of a what they call both sidesism that much of the press uses. So even in this last debate, I saw people blaming Joe Biden for what happened in the debate. I'm like, come on now, seriously. But that's the way people see it because they've been schooled that way. So the institutions really haven't caught up with the terrible tantrums and narcissism and sheer dominance of Trump's personality. It's up to the voters to fix this, if it's going to be fixed.
Well, on that, Kirk asks, on a scale of 1 to 10, how worried are you about the current state of our democracy, and can it survive another 4 years of the current administration?
Well, I'd like to tell you I'm really worried about it, but it probably will survive, even if Trump is reelected. It may not be the same democracy. If you speak out, you're liable to find the IRS is auditing your taxes. You may find that your neighbor who's a Republican got away with getting a no-bid contract from the government that you wanted, but somehow it never got released for bid. There'd be a lot more favors done. There'd be a lot more politics involved in the business community. Donald Trump has a tremendous ability to seek out his enemies and punish them. And the friends are pretty good at cozying their way in there and getting the economics to work for them. And as long as there's money in politics, getting that money out there to your friends and then tell them to donate. So it makes it harder. It'll be an uphill fight for the Democrats. What I worry about is the future of the Democratic Party, because we have to have workable ideas. We've got to move back to our base. And I believe Vice President Biden's trying to do that. The base of the Democratic Party has never been urban professionals and Harvard and Yale graduates and Rhodes Scholars. It's always been common, ordinary people. It's been East European immigrants. It's been Catholics. It's been people who work hard 6 days a week and worry about the future for the country, and they're willing to be suckers and losers, so-called, and serve their country when country calls. That's who the Democratic Party has got to get back to. And so we got to pay attention to that. And I think Vice President Biden's trying to move us in that direction.
So just because we only have a couple of minutes left, I'm going to take one more, and I think it's a good one to end on. Lisa asks, how can we as individuals have the greatest impact in moving into a more fair and democratic society?
Well, it is a good one to end on. I mean, I think you have to have a lifelong passion for trying to look at the bigger issues, bigger than your income, your health, your children's education. I think you've got to reach outside the home and outside your business profession. So it can be through charities, it can be through church organizations, it can be through political movements, it can be through writings and culture, it can be through music, but somehow what gives meaning to life and what's made America great, in my view, has been that Americans have had a greater vision, that it wasn't about selfishness, it was about how to serve a larger community. And I think if we can take our young people and convince them that really professions shouldn't be ranked by how much money you might make at the age of 30, it's really about what your satisfaction is from serving others. That's the basic gift that education gives us, is the opportunity to be part of the creation process for the next step in society. And we have to cherish that, nourish it, and help young people see it. I think that's the real challenge.
And I think that's the perfect place to end this. General Clark, I just want to say thank you so much for this on behalf of the Westport Library and our community. Really an honor to have you here tonight. Thank you for your insight and your candor. And for everybody watching at home, thank you all so much for being here. And I hope everybody stays safe and stays well. Thank you all, and good night.
Thank you.